Welcome, everyone, to another exciting evening of the Return to Zion. And tonight we're going to be looking at the leadership in the Return to Zion, the leaders and where authority was coming from, and also kind of the difficulty in handling different political groups. Okay, it's a lot to handle in just 1 hour, but let's see how much we can talk about in this time. So, as a reminder, one of the things we can't forget in the Return to Zion is just how much authority comes from the Persian kings, right? It's Cyrus that allows the Judeans, the Israelites, to come back to their homeland and to rebuild their temple. It's Darius who once also gives permission to rebuild the temple. And this is always in everyone's mind. Everyone knows, and the leaders that we have, both Ezra and Nehemiah, and also, of course, Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar, who's the first kind of ruler, they all get their authority in the final analysis from the Persian king. The Persian king has appointed them. And yet there are also all sorts of internal politics and things that we saw in a previous class happens kind of without the Persian king really involving himself because he's far away, right? So that whole battle that Nehemiah was facing in terms of building the wall, all of that was very much kind of out of sight and out of mind of the Persian king. The Persian king had given Nehemiah the permission to do this, and yet he was embattled to the point that he was scared of an assassination and also of an actual army attacking. Okay, so now let's take a look and once again kind of look at the different power structures that we have through the Return to Zion. And what I hope is that at the end we'll also have a little bit of time to look a little bit beyond the Return to Zion in an interesting piece of an interesting artifact that we still have from the Persian period, but in between this period and the Hellenistic one. Okay, so let's take a look. As a reminder, the first pair we really look at in the Return to Zion are Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, right? So Zerubbabel is the peha, he is the governor, and Yeshua is the Kohen Gadol, is the high priest. And the two of them act together. They're the ones who are going to rebuild the temple. They are, when we talk about in the vision of Zechariah, and we talk about the two, we think of them as olive branches because in our symbol we have the two olive branches on the sides of the menorah. That's Zechariah's vision. It's actually two olive trees is what he sees. Those two olive trees are represent Yoshua and Zerubbabel. Why? Because they are both anointed. The king, quote unquote, is anointed, and so is the high priest. These two are going to be the leaders who kind of spearhead the rebuilding of the temple. Now, what we know is, of course, that they don't seem to have finished it, even though, despite the promise from Haggai that Zerubbabel is going to be the one who finishes the temple, and all sorts of expectations of Zerubbabel that he will be essentially a messianic ruler, bringing in the messianic age. We see these expectations from Haggai and Zechariah, and yet these don't come to pass. We mentioned when we were talking about them as what happened to Zerubbabel. First of all, it's not 100% clear that something happened. The fact that he's not mentioned at the dedication of the temple could simply be because he's just not emphasized there in terms of the final dedication of the temple, that he just doesn't want to mention him. However, it is a little strange that he doesn't appear there. It's very possible that either he simply died or he was recalled by the Persian emperor. This was a standard move by Persian emperors. Usually the peha was not allowed to rule a very long time for exactly this reason, that you didn't want him to become a king. You didn't want to give him enough time for his rulership to be assumed and actually for him to become kind of a king in his own right. And certainly that would happen if there were rumors coming back to the capital that the Judeans are treating this guy like a messianic king, or they're expecting him to be a messianic king. That would be a great reason to recall him to the capital. And I think that that's probably what happened. I don't think he died, because I think that if he had died, that would have had to be dealt with in the text. The text would have had to explain why he died or how he was killed or what happened. Remember that Ezra and Nehemiah, as opposed to Haggai and Zechariah, when we're looking at the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, it does not talk about any Messianic age that's different than an autonomous region under Persian rule. In other words, in Ezra and Nehemiah, the fulfillment of God's promise to Israel is being able to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city under an autonomous rule within the Persian Empire. So as opposed to Haggai and Zechariah, which actually see Zerubbabel as being a Messianic king that's going to be going beyond the Persian Empire. This is going to essentially overturn the Persian Empire, or at least, Persian Empire will go away, and this Messianic kingdom will be there. So it's a different approach, which is also maybe why Ezra and Nehemiah doesn't have Zerubbabel at the end, at the dedication of the temple. But if he disappeared, for Ezra and Nehemiah, that's not a big deal. The ruler is always a ruler within the Persian Empire. Okay. I mean, now I mentioned, and this is actually going to be important. Again, I've mentioned why academically we usually seem to think that Nehemiah is before Ezra. Let's take a look at those verses. Okay, so give me just a moment to pull up those verses so you can actually see inside why we say that. All right. Okay. In Nehemiah 12, Nehemiah 12, right? Nehemiah Yud Bet, we see a list of the high priests through the generations. Okay. That's in verse 10, Pasuk Yud. Okay. And we have it's a genealogical list. Okay. Yeshua holidet Yoyakim, Yoyakim holidet Yoyashiv, Elyashiv et Yoyada. So we have this genealogical list. These are the high priests. Okay. So how can we place Ezra and Nehemiah? We can place them because we actually have their high priests. So let's take a quick look here. So in Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, and in the story of Nehemiah, so it's Nehemiah 3, Nehemiah Gimel. Vayakam Elyashiv HaKohen HaGadol Ve'achav HaKohanim, right? Elyashiv, the high priest, and his brethren priests arose, and they built Shar Hatzon, the sheep gate. Okay, so if we go back to our list, here we have Elyashiv. So let's go back to our list, and we have Yoshua begot. Remember, Yeshua is our first, is Zerubbabel's high priest. He has his son is Yoyakim. Yoyakim's son is Elyashiv. Okay, this is Elyashiv. This is Nehemiah's Kohen Gadol. So what does Ezra? Who is Ezra's priest? Let's take a look at Ezra 10, Ezra Yud, in verse 6, Pasuk Vav. Vayakam Ezra melifnei Beit Elohim, vayelech elishkat Yehochanan ben Elyashiv, vayelech sham lechem locham. So Ezra goes up, and he is essentially going to fast. He goes to the chamber of Yehochanan, the son of Elyashiv. Let's go back to our list. Okay, it says here, Yochanan, the son of Elyashiv. All right, and so if we look here, the assumption is actually, because we don't really have Yochanan here, we have Yonatan, right? That in fact, what we're talking about is Yonatan. In other words, not the son of Elyashiv, but the grandson of Elyashiv. And so what we have here is a high priest, and that would make sense. That would make sense if we're talking about a different Artaxerxes, because we have the year of Artaxerxes, and then Ezra gets there, and then Nehemiah gets there, and they overlap. But what if it's a different Artaxerxes? Because we have numerous Artaxerxes. So if it's Artaxerxes the first versus Artaxerxes the second, that would make sense that Ezra's Kohen Gadol high priest is the grandson of Nehemiah's high priest. So if we recall how Nehemiah, on the one hand, how Nehemiah got his authority, right? Nehemiah gets his authority through Artaxerxes himself, right? Nehemiah is a cupbearer. He asked to return. He has a special place in court, and clearly the Artaxerxes likes him a lot because Artaxerxes allows him to rebuild Jerusalem, something that Artaxerxes previously said, no way is it happening, right? But when Nehemiah says, how can I be happy without it being rebuilt? He allows him to rebuild it. Not only does he allow him to rebuild it and be the peha, be the governor of Judea, he recalls him, and then he allows him to return, which is also pretty unusual. So we know that Nehemiah has a pretty special place for Artaxerxes. If we look at Ezra, the source of his authority is a little different. Let's take a look. Here we are. So Artaxerxes, when he appoints Ezra, he says very much Ezra HaKohen HaSofer, the priest, the scribe, Sofer Divrei Mitzvot Hashem V'chukav Al Yisrael. He is going to be a scribe for all the commandments of God and his laws for Israel. Artaxerxes Melech Machaya Ezra Chana Safar Data Dialad Shmaya Gemir Uchenet. So he says, you are a scholar of the law, right? And because you are a scholar of the law, I'm telling you, Kol Kava, I'm skipping a little bit ahead. I'm reading now from Ezra Zion Yudalad, that's Ezra 7:14. Kol Kava dimin kada malka v'shiv'at yatoi shliach lebakara al Yehud v'Yerushalem b'dat elahach dividach. Of course, this is in Aramaic. You are essentially appointed by the king and his 7 advisors. You are going to be the auditor, the regulator of Judea and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hands. In other words, you are a scholar. You know the law, and you will make sure this law is applied. And that seems to be the source of Ezra's authority, even for the Persian king. In other words, Ezra knows the law, and that's what his job is. His job is to make sure that law is applied. Now, at the same time, what does Ezra need to do in order for everyone to be on board? Actually, let's go back to what does Nehemiah need to do for everyone to be on board? Remember that they have the hard power in terms of being appointed by the king, right? However, what they need to do still is they have to be leaders. Okay. So here, for example, when he's about to rebuild the city, this is when Nehemiah first comes to the city, he does a secret tour of the city at night. No one knows. And then he says to all the Jews, this is what I did. I just did a tour of the city. V'omar lehem atem ro'im hara'a asher anachnu va, asher Yerushalayim chareva, u'shara nitztu va'esh, lechu v'nivne et chomat Yerushalayim, v'lo niyeh od cherpa. This is in Nehemiah Bet Yud Zayin, Nehemiah 2:17. So he says, you see the evil state that we're in. Jerusalem is in ruins. Its gates have been burned in fire. Let us go and build the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be a disgrace. V'agid lehem et yad Elohai asher hitova alai, v'af divrei hamelech asher amar li, v'yomru nakum uvaninu v'chazku yedehem latova. And how does Nehemiah get them to do this? He says, God has been watching out for me. And even the king is on my side. And then they said, okay, let's go and let's build. And Nehemiah is very good at this. Nehemiah is good at just reaching into the hearts of the people and saying, this is how you're feeling, right? This is how we all feel, right? And I'm telling you, we're going to succeed, right? So Nehemiah faces more than opposition from within. He does face some opposition from within. He faces, actually, I should say, opposition from within and without, because he's Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tovia, the Ammonite, and Geshem, the Arab. They're all opposing him. And not only are they opposing him, but he has issues with, so they oppose him and they try to perhaps assassinate him. They threaten him with blackmail. They try to raise some kind of, one assumes, some kind of mini army to actually fight the builders, that then Nehemiah has to get them all, get the people building, say, you need to fight for your families and for your homes to do all that. But at the same time, there are these leaders, these external leaders have built internal alliances. If we look at Nehemiah 6:18, okay, he's talking about, let's actually go back a bit. This is, again, he's trying to get everyone to build, and it says all of the nations around were afraid. Why? Because they saw the city being built has a tremendous amount of meaning in terms of the power structure of the whole area. And they wanted to stop. Okay? And it says, Gam bayamim hahem, marbim chorei Yehuda. I'm reading now from Nehemiah 6, Yud Zayin. So that's, again, Nehemiah 6:17. Gam bayamim hahem, marbim chorei Yehuda, igrotehem, holchot al tovia, vasher letovia, ba'ot alehem. Right? There are nobles in Judah that are writing regularly, corresponding with Tovia. Tovia, the essentially the enemy from Nehemiah's point of view. Ki rabim bihuda balei shvu'alo. Ki chatanu l'shchania ben Arach v'Yochanan beno lakachet bat Meshulam ben Berechia. So he says there are many people in Yehuda who are his allies, essentially, because he is a son-in-law of Shechania, and Yehochanan, because Yochanan, his son, and his son Yochanan married the daughter of Meshulam ben Berechia, right? Gam tovotav hayu omrim lefanai, udvarai hayu motziim lo igrot shalach tovia liar. So they were the people around who had these alliances by marriage with Tovia, are speaking for Tovia to Nehemiah, saying, oh, he's actually a good guy, right? And at the same time, Tovia is writing him threatening letters, and they're telling Tovia everything that's going on. So Nehemiah is dealing with a lot of issues, and he essentially, but from his point of view, these people are the enemy. So he just has to deal with, and we saw previously that one of the things that Nehemiah had to deal with were these people actually planning for battle against him at the same time as they were also threatening his life individually, and he also had to deal with fake prophets, right? If we go to, let me try to find the correct verse C, he says, and this is when he's trying to separate them from their foreign wives. Look at what he says. He says, Ubnei Yoyada ben Eliashiv HaKohen HaGadol Chatan L'Sanballat HaChoroni V'Avrichehu Me'alai. This is in Nehemiah Yud Gimel Chavchet, Nehemiah 13:28. One of the sons of Yehoyada, the son of Eliashiv the high priest, okay, has a grandson who's the son-in-law of Sanballat HaChoroni, the Choronite, who one of Nehemiah's sworn enemies. And Nehemiah says, and I expelled him, right? And he expels him. This he puts in the context of getting rid of foreign wives, but it's also a personal betrayal. And we're going to see another personal betrayal as well.
What didn't expel them from where? From Jerusalem? Or
from
just
the priesthood? Probably from the priesthood, possibly from Jerusalem.
Because it says Me'alai.
Okay, Vavricheo Me'alai could be from the halls of power, but it would certainly be from the administration of the temple, because Nehemiah is heavily involved in the administration of the temple, as we'll see now. So let's take another look at another place where he's essentially being betrayed by Eliashiv, his own Kohen Gadol, his own high priest. Nehemiah was recalled, and then he's allowed to come back. And he says, ובכל זה לא הייתי בירושלים, כי בשנת 32 לארתחשסט מלך בבל באתי אל המלך, ולקץ ימים נשאלתי מן המלך. Okay? He says, during all this time period, I was not in Jerusalem, because in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, the king of Babel, I went back to the king. And only after a certain period of time did I ask from the king to come back. Vavo Yerushalayim, and remember, I noted that this shows how much the king appreciated him, that he and valued him, that he allowed him to come back in this way. And it says, "Vavol Yerushalayim, vavina v'ra'a asher asa el yashiv l'tovia, lasot lo nishka b'chatzrei Beit Elohim." Nishka equals lishka, a chamber, right? So I came to Jerusalem and I understood this horrible thing that El Yashiv did for Tovia, a horrible thing to me, not to Tovia, to make him a chamber within the court of the house of God. In other words, the temple courtyard has all these chambers. He actually gave him a dedicated, Tovia now has a dedicated chamber within the temple precincts. Now remember what I said, Nehemiah is heavily involved in the administration of the temple, right? That's why I said him expelling his high priest's grandson at least means he's expelled from the priesthood, from the active priesthood, right? Is he expelled from all of Jerusalem? That's not clear. Certainly from the active priesthood, right? So I was really upset, and I threw out all of Tovia's stuff from the chamber, okay? Va'omra vayitaru halishakot vashiva sham klei Beit Elohim et hamincha v'et haLevanot. I said, okay, I want you to cleanse the chambers, possibly because they had this Gentile person in them. Maybe that's why. But also, who knows what stuff is there? Who knows what he put there? So I want everything purified, and I returned the vessels and the grain offering and the livona, the frankincense for the incense. Okay, so you had a chamber. There was stuff that was supposed to be in this chamber. So what was in this chamber before that was cleared out? So he looks into what's going on, what's missing here. Ve'ed'ah ki minayot haleviim lo nitana ve'yivrachu ish l'sadeo haleviim ve'masharim osem ha'melecha. Now, I want to make a pause here, okay? I want to make a note here. One of the things that we see here with Nehemiah, okay, when Ezra, I'm going to remind you, Ezra has a lot of participation from the people. And when he wants everyone to mourn and to repent, he fasts and he's like, oh, what a horrible thing is happening. When he wants everyone to separate from their foreign wives, he makes a big thing. Oh, no, what will happen? And we will be expelled. And he fasts and he makes a whole to-do. And everyone watches it and they're like, oh, no, he's taking it really seriously. We need to take it really seriously. And he is able to reach them that way. And in general, Ezra, and when he comes for him time to read the Torah, the people are ready to start. They're like, here, we have a stand for you. Come and read the Torah to us. So Ezra knows how to reach the people in that way. Nehemiah has a mix of convincing people and using force. So, for example, he doesn't talk to Tovia and say, hey, could you get your stuff out? He throws his stuff out. I am in charge. You are not. I am back. I'm throwing out your stuff. I don't care what the high priest did. It's very, very clear that Nehemiah is the guy with the power here, right? El Yashiv is not stopping him from doing anything he wants to do, right? If Nehemiah says your grandson's expelled, then your grandson is expelled, right? If Nehemiah says this guy doesn't get a chamber in the temple precincts, he does not. Nehemiah takes the stuff and throws it out. I'll remind you that when Nehemiah wants people to not sell stuff in Jerusalem, he says you are not allowed in the city, and he has guards. And when they say, well, no problem, we'll sleep overnight outside the gates, he says, hey, I'm going to do something to you. It's not going to go well for you. And he's like, and since then, I haven't had a problem. Because Nehemiah knows when to use force. And at the same time, when the Judeans when the richer Judeans are creating a situation where the poorer Judeans are indentured servants to them and are in an inescapable cycle of debt slavery, Nehemiah speaks to the leaders and he says, this is a bad thing. This is not a good thing. This is immoral. It's immoral and it's ridiculous because in Babylon, we used to redeem Jewish slaves that had been sold into slavery. And here, what are you doing? You're creating a situation where you're putting them into slavery. And they accept it. They're like, you're right. You're right. We've done a bad thing. And Nehemiah sets an example. He says, we also will release all our debt, I and my entourage, and they release their debt. And Nehemiah knows when to convince and when to simply use force. And he tends to use force more when they're not his people. When they're his people, he can be like, okay, we're working from the same ideas and the same morality and the same idea of what should be done. When it's the enemy, right? or when it's foreign people, he's like, okay, you're out. I'm throwing your stuff out of the chamber. Why are you even going to listen to me? I have the physical power. I have the power to just get it done. So we see that Nehemiah had a lot of simply power. Like he could physically do things to make sure that things were working the way he felt they needed to work. Now let's take a look at at the situation that he deals with now. And again, we're going to see that, and we're going to see another example of him being diplomatic. Let's take a look. So here he says, so he purifies the rooms, and then what does he find out? What's missing in the temple? Ve'eda ki minayot haleviim lo nitana ve'virchu ish l'sadeu haleviim v'mishorim oseh melacha. The portions that were supposed to be dedicated to the Levites had not been contributed by anyone. Okay, so the Levites and the singers,Amishorim, right, and who did the temple service, they've all gone to their own fields. They weren't getting paid. They weren't getting the part of the sacrifices and the contributions that they should have been getting, right? Really, frankly, from the priest, assuming that people gave it to the priest should have been separating out for them. They weren't. So they all went to their own fields to support themselves. Variva et skanim v'omra madua nazav beit Elohim v'etbetzem v'amidem alom dam. So he goes to the people who are in charge of the service. Now, we actually don't know. You can't actually tell. Are these Kohanim, are these priests, or are these simply people who are officers who are in charge of this? He says, how can the house of God be neglected this way? And I gathered them and I put them in their place. Like, this is what you need to do. V'chol Yehuda, so first he says, okay, people clearly haven't been contributing at all. Not that someone hasn't been giving of the contributions. People have not been contributing the way they need to contribute. So he first says to the people in charge, we need contributions. How could you neglect the temple this way? So everyone brought the tithes the way they should have been doing it all along, right? They bring the grain, the wine, the olive oil, all of that they bring for the vault in the vaults, right? V'otzra al otzarot Shelemiah hakohen v'tzadok hasofer uftaya min haleviim. V'al yadam Chanan ben Zakor ben Matanya ki nemanim nechshavu v'aleihem lachlok lachehem. So what does he do? He doesn't say to the priests, you guys screwed up, because the priests were getting it. It's clear from here that the people who haven't been getting their portion are the Levites and the singers, right? Clearly the priests have. He doesn't come to say to the priests, hey, you guys forget it. You're not in charge of anything anymore. I can't trust you. What he does is he has a representative of the priests, he has a scribe, he has a representative of the Levites, and with another overseer, because they are trustworthy. Again, Shelemiah HaKohen, Shelemiah the priest, Tzadok HaSofer, Tzadok the scribe, Pedayah min HaLeviim, Pedayah from the Levites, and next to them, someone who is apparently not from these groups, Hanan ben Zakor ben Matanya, Ki ne'emanim nechshavu, right? Because they were considered faithful and trustworthy, v'aleihem lachalok la'achehem, and it's on them to share with their brethren, right? So in other words, he's like, here's a committee. I'm doing a committee with representatives from each group, and this is how it's going to work from now on. Now you can see from the way he ends this just how embattled Nehemiah was, because he says, "Zachra li Elohai al zot v'altemach chasadai asher asiti b'veit Elohai u'b'mishmarav." God, remember me for this, right? Don't erase everything that I've done for the house of God and for its attendants. In other words, people are saying, it seems like people are saying Nehemiah sucks. And he's like, God, remember that I did this for the temple and for the people who are working in the temple. He has a couple places where he says something like that. God, remember me for this. God, remember that I did good, right? So it's clear that he couldn't really stop fighting. He was always, right after this, there's a passage about how, once again, he saw Judeans breaking the Shabbat. דורכים גיטות בשבת, ומביאים הרמות ועומסים על החמורים, ואף יין ענבים ותאנים וכל מסע, ומביאים ירושלים ביום השבת, So again, right after this is that whole passage where he sees people bringing things on Shabbat and he has to shut it down. Note that there are people who are not Judeans, but there are also Judeans who are doing it. There are Judeans who are actually making wine on Shabbat, and then there are Judeans who are bringing grain to sell on Shabbat. And so he has to do what he did in terms of actually physically stopping that as a possibility. In this case, he physically stops it. He brings the full power of his entourage to bear to stop this happening. Nehemiah sets up this system, right, where donations to the temple are given to a committee, essentially a committee with representatives. So when Ezra comes to Jerusalem and he is sent with all sorts of money and offerings, and so he comes with a lot of silver and gold, and we see here that in Ezra 8, Ezra Chet Lamed, Ezra 8:30, he in fact gives it v'kiblu hakohanim v'aleviim mishkal hakesef v'zahav v'kelim lavi l'Yerushalayim l'beit Eloheinu. In fact, what happens is he comes, he enters, he's traveling, and he gives it over to priests and Levites. They are going to be in charge of the gold and the silver, right? And when they arrive in Jerusalem, what happens? Uvayom ha'revi'i nishkal hakesef v'zahav v'kelim v'beit Eloheinu al yad meremot ben Uriah hakohen v'imo Elazar ben Pinchas v'mahem Yozavad ben Yeshua ben Oadia ben Binoy ha'leviim. He gives the silver, gold, and vessels to a committee, right? Who does he give them to? Meremot, the son of Uriah, the priest, and Elazar, the son of Pinchas. It sounds like he's also a priest. And with them, Yozavad ben Yoshua ben Oadia ben Binoy ha'leviim, and with them 2 Levites, right? So he gives the gold and silver and vessels to a committee that's in charge of the contributions to the temple. So one of the arguments is Nehemiah set up this system that all contributions go to a committee, and Ezra, when he comes, gives the contributions to a committee with representatives of the priests and Levites, so that everything is going to be distributed as it should be. So I want to kind of give a quick overview of what we saw so far, okay? What we saw so far is, what we started with was, in terms of not the very first generation, but very early on, Yoshua and Zerubbabel, because you have Shesh Batzar is the very first generation of people come back. But then we have Zerubbabel and Yoshua, where we have that ruler plus high priest. And we know that Nehemiah and Ezra, they each have a high priest. However, and recall, and I will say, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah wants us to see Ezra and Nehemiah as Nehemiah is the ruler and Ezra is the high priest. But it's likely that historically they were not in the same generation, that they did not actually overlap. They were under different Artaxerxes, okay? So in that case, what we see is actually, so the high priest may have a role, but with what we see, we don't see that they're particularly prominent in terms of political power. Now, of course, there are many generations of these rulers, of these governors. So, but under Nehemiah, certainly it's very clear that Nehemiah has the power. Nehemiah has what we call hard power, right? He can actually physically just say, this is the way things are going to be. But he also frequently takes the role of, listen to me, isn't this wrong? Don't you want it to be this way? That's the way that he gets the walls of the city built, by understanding how to inspire people and how to say, this is what we really want. And that is also how he manages to convince the leaders to forgive the debts and thereby free the debt slaves, by simply saying to them, don't you see that what you're doing is immoral? And they agree, because the ideas are coming from the same view. But there are times when he doesn't even try. With Shabbat, he simply says, hey, we're going to make sure no one can come in and sell their wares in Jerusalem on Shabbat. And if you try, you are going to be in big trouble physically. You are not going to come out of this well. And so he uses both types of power, whereas Ezra seems to draw his power as from both the authority of the law, of knowing the law. That's how he gets his appointment. And also he's able to kind of inspire people just by his own acts, by kind of saying, oh no, what will happen to us, and fasting and mourning and crying and in sackcloth and ashes. and because we're going to be thrown out of the land once again because we're intermarrying, right? So that's what Ezra does. He doesn't seem to have the same hard power that Nehemiah does. The problem, of course, is that we're missing a lot of information in terms of how does that continue? We know that once we get to the Hellenistic period, the high priest absolutely has power, right? And the high priest has actual power, right? Not just he isn't just a priest in the temple. The question is, what is there in between? It's hard to know. One of the things that we can look at is we are going to just briefly look at a letter from Elephantine. Elephantine is all the way in the south of Egypt, where there were Jewish mercenaries in the time of the Persian period who had been sent to Egypt, and they have their own kind of little colony in Elephantine among the Egyptians. And there's quite a great amount of tension between the groups, even though we can see from the text that we have that there were also contracts between them. There were absolutely relations between them and the local Egyptians. But at the same time, the local Egyptians essentially had a pogrom and burned down the temple of the Jews in Elephantine. And the Jews are then without a temple. And so what do? They write to Jerusalem and they write to Judea.
What year are they doing this? Is this after Ezra?
Oh, yeah. So it's the 5th century BCE.
Ezra is also 5th century BC. 458 or something, or 50.
Yeah, this is the letter that we're going to be looking at is 407 BCE. So,
right. So it's the end of the 5th century.
Yeah. Well, it's the letters in general are 5th century. What's called the Passover letter is about 419 BCE, and what we're going to be looking at is at 407 BCE. It's the 17th year of Darius II. Okay. Here we are. This is just so you know, this is kind of what the letter looks like, right, on papyrus.
Where did they find this letter?
In Elephantine.
So it's letter was written to them, or it's a copy of what they sent?
Okay. This is a draft. These are copies of what they sent, and then also copies of the memo they received back. Okay. I am going to zoom in.
Looks like ancient Hebrew letters, like not Ktav Meluban.
No, it's if you look back, let me show you again. It's Ktav Merubah. See that? It's Aramaic. Right? Aramaic.
Reminiscent of what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I mean, it's to me, it's a lot more sloppy. Okay, so this is the first draft of the letter. Usually when I do this, I look at the second draft because the second draft is longer. It has more information in it. But for our purposes, the first draft is going to be better because it gives us the full information of who they're addressing it to. And whereas with the second draft, we kind of reconstruct it according to the first draft. It's missing that piece. Okay. So who are they writing to? El Adonai, I'm going to go to the English also, right? El Adoneno begohi pechat Yehuda, avadayach Yidanya v'chaverav hakohanim asher b'yev habira. Okay? To our Lord Begohi, right? Who is the governor of Judea, right? Your servants, Yidanya and his brethren, his friends, the priests that are in Yev, the fortress. Bira here, not capital, it means fortress, right? And so who are they writing to? They are writing to the Samaritan governor of the area. The peha of the area at this time is Samaritan. Okay, so they're writing to a Samaritan. They're going to write him and say, listen, there was this pogrom, our temple was burned, and we need help rebuilding. And they're going to explain that they wrote already. This isn't the first time they're writing. Af lifneze be'et asher zot hara'a achor nasta lanu igeret shalachnu el adonenu ve'el Yehochanan hakohen hagadol v'chaverav hakohanim asher b'Yerushalayim ve'ostan achav shel anani v'chori hayudim igeret achat lo shalchu elenu. They said, before this, and you can look on the right, it is here. Moreover, before this, So at this time, when this bad thing was done to us, we sent a letter to our Lord. And what it seems to be saying is we did send a letter to you, right? And also, but more importantly, to Yehochanan, the high priest, and his colleagues, the priests who are in Jerusalem. And to Astanis, the brother of Anani, and the nobles of the Jews. We wrote to the Jews already. We've written to the Jews. They did not send us a single letter. Right? Look and this is the Hebrew. This is not the Igeret achat lo shalchuli. They did not send us one letter. So this is written in Aramaic, and what I'm giving you here are translations, right? So the translation on what you're seeing on the left is a Hebrew translation of the Aramaic, right? I'm not reading the original Aramaic. It's a little bit easier this way. So we're reading the Hebrew and we're reading the English. So, but the idea is that we wrote, saying, what happened? This happened to us. We need to rebuild. We did the right thing. We wrote to you, but we also wrote to the high priest in Jerusalem and his priests to help us rebuild our temple. They know, of course, that they have no idea that they're not supposed to have a temple outside of Jerusalem. It's very clear to them that they should have a temple, that they should get help, and the high priest should help them. If the high priest isn't going to answer them, who is the next person they're going to write to? Well, they're going to write to the governor of Judea and Samaria, because the governor of Judea and Samaria does have responsibility to help Jews, right? They, as Jews, belong to Judea and Samaria in the Persian Empire. Obviously not completely. They note that the pogrom happened when the governor was away, right? That's one of the things that they say. It's like they don't say, it's not like, oh, they're in Elephantine without any sort of recourse to anything. But the idea is that the people who can help them are in Jerusalem or the governor of Judea and Samaria. Okay? And then when they close the letter, they say, I'll just read it in the English. Okay. Moreover, we sent all these words in one letter to Delaiah and Shelemiah, sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria. Right? We have said this, they are covering all their bases. Right? We are sending it to the governors of the area so that they can help. Because we, as Jews, with a Jewish temple, it makes sense for us to call on the governors of Judea and Samaria to send us help us rebuild. Okay, so here we see the memorandum that they have, and here this is actually the Aramaic. What did Bagohi and Delaiah say? Remember, Bagohi and Delaiah. Delaiah is the son of Sanballat, and Bagohi was the person they originally wrote the letter to, right? Bagohi, the governor of Yehuda. So they've sent it to the governor of Yehuda and the governor of Samaria. And what did they write back? They write back that, I'll just read it in English. You may say in Egypt, before our Samis, about the altar house of the God of heaven, which in Elephantine, the fortress built, was formerly before Cambyses. In other words, they one of their arguments is that this temple goes way back to Cambyses, right? That this temple goes way back. So they deserve to have it rebuilt. And which that wicked Vidranga demolished in year 14 of King Darius. Vidranga is the Egyptian who kind of leads the pogrom. To rebuild it on its site as it was formerly, and they shall offer the meal offering and the incense upon that altar just as formerly was done. Here, uminchata ulivonata yakrivun al midbachazach lekabel zi lekadman havamit abed. Right? So they should bring meal offerings and incense. So why meal offering and incense? Okay, in other words, they are able to rebuild. They are going to get support to rebuild the temple, and you will bring meal offering and incense. One of the theories, this is stretching a little bit, but perhaps one of the theories is that the governor of Judea, who is a Samaritan, he's not a Judean, but he knows darn well that the high priest in Jerusalem is not going to be happy that there's a temple outside of Jerusalem. There's not supposed to be a temple outside of Jerusalem. And so he says to them, okay, but you can offer only incense and meal offerings. You don't get to offer meat offerings. I think it's a nice idea. I do think it's a little bit too fine-tuned. Like, who's going to even know? Who would know? You know what I would think? I would actually think maybe this is a way for him to kind of cover it's like CYA, that he wants to kind of cover himself so that he can say to his subject Judeans, okay, I told them, I'm helping them rebuild, but I told them just meal offerings and incense. See, here's the memo. I just told them. And the Egyptians and the Jews in Elephantine, they're going to do what they're going to do. They're not looking at this letter and saying, oh, no, we can't bring meat offerings. Would you? I wouldn't. They're just going to bring what they bring. This way, officially, he didn't say to them to bring meat offerings. So maybe this is a way to kind of smooth it over, and it gives him an out, and he can still support their temple. And what we see is, the reason I brought this is to kind of fill in a gap of who is ruling in this time. Who are the people who are in charge? So from their point of view, you've got a governor who's in charge. They first go to the priest, the high priest, and the high priest probably doesn't answer because he doesn't want to support a temple from outside of Israel, and certainly of Jerusalem. He's not going to particularly support that. And yet it's very clear that the governor of the Samaritan governor does see himself as a ruler of everyone connected to Judea, right? He is going to send support. The clearly not Jewish people who are ruling over the area at this time. Why are they ruling over the area? Not because they conquered it, but because they've been appointed by the Persian emperor. They've been appointed by the Persian emperor. They have a responsibility to the people who live there, and they are going to support rebuilding this temple very far from them. It's the southern tip of Egypt. It's really far away, but these are Judeans. These are Judeans with a Jewish temple to the God of the heavens, and they are going to help them rebuild it. So it kind of gives us an idea of what it was like going forward. The question remains, what did Judeans feel about their status when they had a non-Jewish governor? Because when we have in Ezra and Nehemiah are only Jewish governors, right? We don't have a Samaritan governor of Judea. Here there is a Samaritan governor of Judea. What does that mean to the people who live in the area, right? Do they see that as something horrible? Does that see like, well, this is what we're living through? We don't know, right? And I'll remind you that we do have one chapter in Ezra and Nehemiah where, with a very different tone, that talks about, and here we are slaves because we're ruled by a king where we don't own our own land, etc. So there clearly are different periods of time where the Judeans who live in the area have a different attitude towards their rulers than what we see in most of Ezra and Nehemiah. So what I wanted to show here was kind of the complexity of the different types of leadership that we see in this period. At the same time, some of the kind of really cool things and ways that these leaders dealt with the issues in terms of using different types of power and influence. And I hope you enjoyed it. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye.